Hello, I decided to put in just one video what used to be in two videos. So this is part two and part one no longer exists. So it will go directly to poem by Guillaume Apollinaire in order to show how French readers read a French poem, which leads to, of course, an analysis of this poem. So this is a famous poem by Guillaume Apollinaire called L'Espionne, the spy, with a beautiful English translation next to it. So let's start with reading it first, and then we'll see where we go, analyzing the rhythm of the poem, the sounds, the syllables, the everything, the ideas that are in there, the images that are in there, and how we can produce a general interpretation of this poem based on all this. So here it is, L'Espionne. Pas l'espionne de l'amour, ma mémoire à peine fidèle, n'eut pour observer cette belle forteresse qu'une heure, un jour. Tu te déguises à ta guise, mémoire espionne du cœur, tu ne retrouves plus l'exquise ruse, et le cœur seul est vainqueur. Mais la vois-tu, cette mémoire, les yeux bandés, prête à mourir? Elle affirme qu'on peut l'en croire, mon cœur vaincra sans cours férir. So here's a beautiful translation by Enheid Greet, the spy. Love's pale spy, my memory barely faithful, had only an hour one day to chart that lovely citadel. You disguise yourself as you please, memory, my heart's spy. That artful stratagem you'll recover, never the heart alone is a winner. But do you see my memory as blindfolded she prepares to die, still insisting that she knows my heart will win without a blow? All right, so let's move on and see how we can analyze this a little better. So here we have markings on the poem that come from the first video that no longer exists, because I thought it's better to look at the poem itself to understand what this is about. So, for example, what is marked in purple here are the infamous e muet. And so the e muet is the kind of e in French that you're not supposed to pronounce when you read a poem. You don't pronounce it because it's either at the end of a verse or it's between two vowels. And you just don't pronounce them. You pronounce the consonant before them. Then in green, you have the E that is supposed to be pronounced because it's not followed by a vowel, it's followed by a consonant or other reasons. Then I put in red what is called in French the diérèse. Diérèse are two syllables that have to be pronounced separately. For example, here you have espionne. So in that case, you cannot say espionne in that poem. You have to say espionne, espionne, make it two syllables. How do we know that? How do I know that? Well, because I look at the rhythm of the whole poem and I see that the whole poem is made out of octosyllab, 8 syllables, and verses of 8 syllables. And in French tradition, French poetry, the octosyllab already is an indication that this is probably strongly inspired by medieval poetry, because a lot of courtly love poems, a lot of poetry from the Middle Ages, 12th century, a little before, a little after as well, use the octosyllab. Some chansons de geste, some famous poem by Crétin de Troyes, the Tristan et Iseult. The famous Tristan and Iseult is written in octosyllab. So this is a clear indication you have probably a strong influence of courtly love and at least medieval poetry. So in order to have your 8 syllables in the first verse, you cannot say pas l'espionne, you have to say pas l'espionne de l'amour. And this way you have your 8 syllables for the whole poem, which works very, very well. Then in yellow, I indicated the pauses where you breathe when you read the verse. And these are based on sense, on the units, on units that make sense. For example, pas l'espionne de l'amour, ma mémoire à peine fidèle. Those are meaning units, and they tell you where to stop and breathe. Another indication I put in there are the marks about the rhymes. You see amour rhymes with jour, fidèle rhymes with bed. So in that case, we call these rhymes embrace. It's like two people hugging, one person hugging another person. You have the arms surrounding the other two. So we call them embraced rhymes. But you see the last two stanzas have different kind of rhymes, with guise rhyming to exquise, and cœur rhyming with vainqueur, mémoire with croire, mourir with périr. So those rhymes that alternate like this, we call them enlacés and laced, or enlacés. And if they're just, the rhymes are just one after the other, like A, B, B, we call them plat or flat rhymes. So there's no flat rhyme here. They're all embrassés or enlacés, which works very well with the theme of the poem, because you have this hug in the beginning that becomes much more intimate at the end, we believe. And as you probably know, Apollinaire never shied away from erotic poetry, erotic love. He wrote a book in that vein. So we have a love poem about love that becomes probably more physical towards the end. And what I put on the right are those the rhymes, not the rhymes, I'm sorry, the rhythm. You have the first verse with a rhythm of 5-3, 3-5, 5-3. So that shows, of course, when you rhyme as you catch your breath, 5-3, 3-5, 5-3, and then a stable 4-4. All of a sudden, the uneven rhythm becomes even when you talk about the fortress, the stable, strong fortress that is in the middle. And you see that 4-4 announces already the last stanza, which will all be made of rhythm of 4-4. So there's a play with even, uneven, unstable rhythm with very stable rhythm, that fortress of love. And in the middle stanza, you see this clearly alternating between the two uneven rhythms, embracing one even rhythm, 5-3, 2-6, 6-2, 5-3, and then you finish with this very stable, even fortress of love in the last stanza, as the embrace has become much more intimate through the rhymes. Something very interesting in this middle stanza as well is what Apollinaire does with the first verse of the second stanza, "Tu te déguises à ta guise." Now, all this reference to medieval poetry could sound rather conservative and sticking to tradition and all that. However, as you know, Apollinaire is very famous for being a modern poet, of being avant-garde. He was best friends with all the avant-garde artists in Paris of his time, as you've heard. So Apollinaire knows his medieval poetry and tradition extremely well, of course, but he plays with it. He breaks away, from it. And by alternating these even and uneven rhythms, for example, or in that verse, "Tu te déguises à ta guise," which is strange because when you read it, "Tu te déguises à ta guise," then you have "Tu te déguises," 1, 2, 3, 4, at ta guise, 1, 2, 3, 4 and 3, that's 7. So you have a verse all of a sudden that has 7 syllables in the middle of this poem of 8 of the octosyllable. So what's going on there? Well, you realize that he decided to break that poem, to break it, cut it in half. "Tu te déguises à ta guise," which is nice because you're disguising yourself as you please. So you have a switch, you have a change, like memory or love is changing, putting a costume on like a spy. Something is changing. So you have that theme of a sudden change. So that's visually very nice. But on top of it, "tu te déguises," that gives more weight to the even though it's a muet that shouldn't be pronounced, all of a sudden could be pronounced. And it could be pronounced for two reasons. It could be pronounced because this way, then you have 5 and 3. If you pronounce this E that you should not pronounce it, immué, that all of a sudden you pronounce to the guise, at the guise. You pronounce it, you have 5 and 3. So it's breaking the rule that you should not pronounce it. And why do you pronounce it? Because you have this medieval verse this way. And also because in medieval poetry, as you will read, the rule of the immué, reading the muet and the muted E, changed from century to century, changed sometimes from author to author. And there are poems by Guillaume de Machaut and others, where exceptionally here and there you have to read the muet. For a while you could do it. Now it's considered as something you should not do, of course. But clearly Apollinaire here putting this césure and putting this cut at that point right there is clearly playing with us and playing with the tradition, modern tradition, and playing with the avant-garde about this muet. Do we pronounce it? Do we don't pronounce it? Shouldn't we pronounce it? So in a modern sense, no, we should not pronounce it, and you say tu te déguises à ta guise. But in a poetic tradition and medieval tradition, we should probably say tu te déguises à ta guise. So we have a beautiful medieval poem with all its octosyllables. So that's a great invention. It's very visual. It has to do with the sound. It has to do with the poetic tradition. It has to do with medieval tradition confronting modernity, and modernity creating its own rhythm in its own ways. So that's, I think, what we can say about all these in this poem, which takes us now to the final interpretation. Here I included some pictures that came to mind after reading this poem for the first time on the first video. On the top left, we have a picture of an execution in 1915, because at the very end of this poem, there is a verse talking about memory being executed blindfolded and being about to die. So we see in 1915 a man being blindfolded and about to be executed by his fellow soldiers. In the middle, I put a copy of a letter from a medieval manuscript, because on the first verse of the poem there is a reference to love with a capital A. And this love with a capital A, has many elements of the poem, as we saw in the first video, refers to the medieval literature. As we mentioned, the octosyllab, the verse of 8 syllable, is characteristic of a lot of courtly love novels in French by Chrétien de Troyes in particular. And there are many other references to medieval literature throughout this poem. On the left corner, there is a painting that doesn't work with our chronology at all, but it's an intriguing painting by Magritte. It represents a head wounded at the head and bleeding, and this painting is called Memory, La Mémoire, by René Magritte. It was painted in 1948, but Magritte is a famous surrealist poet, and Apollinaire is credited with inventing the word surrealism in a letter he wrote to one of his friends who was a painter. So I thought that was an intriguing coincidence that many years after Apollinaire wrote this poem, Magritte painted this surrealistic painting called Memory. Bottom left is a personal reaction to the title, L'Espionne, of the poem. This is from a famous series of films from 1913. Again, this poem was written in 1915, so it's a silent film from 1913 by Louis Feuillade. Louis Feuillade made several very popular film series at that time, and this woman makes me think of a spy. And of course, Apollinaire was fascinated with cinema, and which was a new invention still at his time, as it was invented with any new invention and any sign of modern science at his time. On the top, so in the middle corner, the most important pictures are in the middle and on the top right corner. In the middle, there's a picture of Apollinaire with this young woman named Madeleine Pagès. So Madeleine Pagès and Apollinaire met on a train in 1915 when Apollinaire was on the train between Nice and Nîmes in order to join his battalion to go back to the front. And Madeleine Pagès was on the same train from that. She was going from Nîmes to Marseille, and Marseille she was going to get on a boat to go to North Africa, to Algeria, where she was a literature teacher. Madeleine Pagès at that time was very young. She was only about 23 years old on that train. And Apollinaire flirted with her and they fell in love and they separated on the train. They kept writing to one another. They got engaged eventually. And so they did have this love relationship and they wrote to each other many letters. He wrote her a lot. And that's an example on the top right of one of the postcards and letters he sent her. And the poem we are reading now, it was in one of those letters he wrote for Madeleine and that he sent to Madeleine in 1915. And so they didn't see each other much. He was at the front in the artillery, and she was in North Africa. She wrote back to him, but there has this long distance relationship that is, of course, connected to this poem, as he's on the front and he's trying to remember this moment that when he met this young woman one day, 1 hour on the train, and they are separated, and his memory is failing at remembering her, but he knows that he's deeply in love with her and that his heart really is deeply involved with her. So those are images that are connected to the poem and that lead us now to the brief interpretation of the text itself. So to conclude, we can see that there are three main ideas in this poem that play with one another from the beginning to the end. The title, of course, is very intriguing, L'Espionne. You read the title of the movie. I was about to say a movie because there were movies at that time made on that theme too, but there you see the title and it's very intriguing. Yeah? A woman spy. What is this going to be about? So you have to theme the theme of espionne and this battle going on, or rivalry, or something that needs to be conquered, to be spied on. Then you have the theme of love, of course, that goes through the poem, the love and the heart. And then you have the idea of memory and what memory has to do with this love and with this spying. So the first, in the first stanza, in the first strophe, we clearly see that memory is spying on love and is struggling to remember this love, struggling to remember this belle forteresse and this beautiful citadel that Apollinaire saw one day, barely an hour on the train, between Nice and Marseille, and he's writing to this woman, and his memory is struggling to remember that moment of happiness and brief encounter that led to this engagement eventually. In the second stanza, this struggle is developed and with memory and memories that change all the time, that where costumes, disguise, disappear, and memory is struggling to find again, to recover the artful stratagem, the l'exquise ruse that led to this love, to this new love. But there's a reassuring piece that appears in the end of this middle stanza, is that the heart alone is a winner. So eventually, if memory is struggling, there's a conviction that the heart eventually will win. So in the last stanza, which is again with a rhythm much more peaceful, much less agitated than the middle one, or even the first one, we have this rhythm 4/4 and these rhymes that are crossed and enlacés in French, like intertwined, in the sense that maybe lovers will be intertwined when they make love, as Apollinaire never shied away from this kind of images. In the last stanza, there is this memoir that is blindfolded and about to be executed, as he is on the front and far away from this love, and has a hard time remembering all these moments and details. And the impact of the war is possibly damaging this memory of these moments that were fleeting and so brief. However, there is a very reassuring line in the end that memory itself always remember that in the end the heart wins, and the heart is will prevail without a blow, without a fight even. So the movement of the poem takes us from this agitation in the beginning and this very uneven rhythms and breathing that is kind of agitated, especially in the middle, through this medieval imagery of Tutor de Guise we saw in the first video. How Tutor de Guise is a very medieval verse for the use of the silent E at the end of de Guise, followed by a one-syllable A. This goes back to medieval poetry explained in the first video. And this concern and movement and agitation leads us verse by verse towards the end, where we have this peaceful moment where the last verse tells us, do not worry, the memory is not that strong, but the heart is there and the love is prevailing. Love is prevailing. So this is a general interpretation that includes everything we said before. In the translation, I highlighted in green the translator who did a wonderful job with a beautiful translation. She said in this line, as blindfolded, she prepares to die. I would, looking at the French, I would have like maybe as blindfolded, prepared to die. There's some subtle differences there, but that's why I highlighted it. But I'm sure she had very good reasons to say she prepares to die instead of prepared to die. But this is an example of I would recommend to read French poetry by first paying attention to, again, what are its elements, what it's made out of, and then how it is put together, and then how it works. How does it work? Like a machine that produces certain effects and on us. And after we consider those three questions, consider some historical knowledge to give a more specific reading of the poem. Feel free to add a lot more, of course. I'm sure you can say a lot more on this poem than we just did. But this is, I believe, a good start. Thank you. Goodbye.